Hi everyone, welcome to our presentation on organizational sustainability. We like to call ourselves the team of the future, and we're made up of Aaron, myself, Alexandria, Anika, and Eric. And yeah, we chose organizational sustainability as our wicked problem, as I said. And together we chose this this wicked problem of organizational sustainability. Because we found this project interesting and exciting because organizations have played such a big role in pollution and helping a society not be sustainable. And if they can create a society that's focused on consumerism and waste, then they can help us create a society built on sustainability as its foundation. So first, we're going to cover the history of organization and sustainability. The first step as we look through this is always going to be the Industrial Revolution. This process really made this transition to fossil fuels, and it brought about this huge economic growth, but it also brought about unregulated pollution that has gone on for generations, really up until the 1960s. And to add on to that, there has just been a major lack of regulation. Government has not made the correct laws and orders that regulate organizations to become sustainable. Sustainability has not been made a priority by local or even global governments, especially here in the West. And with, I believe it's more than 70% of the world is developing right now, this has to be the #1 agenda on our list. This has to be the first thing that we check off, and that these nations are developing in a sustainable way. And a good example of correct government intervention, Anika is going to cover that in the later slides, with the United Nations and those 17 goals of sustainability that we know and love. The last thing for the history is going to be the Green Revolution, which really was brought about in the 1960s due to Rachel Carson's release of Silent Spring, which we're all pretty familiar with. And it really just brought about this realization and this need for a sustainable revolution. And the Green Revolution, it was really the first step in the right direction. And while it was a good first step, it almost made some of the problems more difficult. And that's why this is such a wicked problem. Without proper regulation over the years, it has been really easy for organizations to make vague definitions of sustainable solutions. And a good example of this is, say, cage-free versus pasteurized eggs. Cage-free just means they're taken out of cages, but they're still in these warehouses with little space. Pasteurized means they're free, they're out on a pasture or in a field, and it's really, we just have to hold organizations accountable to tell us what they're doing and just not what they're not doing anymore. And so we're going to move on from this, and we're going to look at some primary actions in this next section. What we're going to look at is transportation. And transportation, I believe, is the biggest way that organizations have not been sustainable. And this problem is not just with like cars and trucks. 90% of the goods transported around the world are transported by cargo ships. And cargo ships have a much higher CO2 footprint than cars and trucks do. And this actually results in the goods transported by organizations to contribute to be one of the biggest polluters on the planet. And so this kind of leads into the next one, in that we have to switch over to renewable energy and renewable resources from that fossil fuel that the Industrial Revolution brought about. And organizations have to set the tone, because if they can make a society that's focused on consumerism, then they can make a society that's focused around sustainability and renewing and using renewable resources and energy. A good example of an organization that's doing this is Ray Anderson, who's the CEO of a carpet company. And it's just a really, really good example, but we're going to cover that in the next slide. And Anika is going to do an awesome job doing that. And the last thing that we're going to look at real quick is executive orders. So focusing on government they also have a huge role to play in regulating organizations and promoting sustainable organizations and companies. A good example of this is Executive Order 13834 that was passed last May in 2018, and it's just the most recent executive order that I could find, and it does a really good job of providing a list of regulations and guidelines for organizations to follow, but within the reasonable list of business operations as well. So it's a good compromise. It's not all the way there, but it's a good step in the right direction, and it's a good example of how the government can intervene in a good way. So next we're going to look at some positive and negative impacts, and Anika is going to cover those for us.
Now that we have a better understanding of where this organizational wicked problem kind of came from, revolving around the history, we know that we can identify stakeholders within that. So specifically looking at their values, beliefs, and norms. These four are some of the main drivers and stakeholders within this wicked problem: industries, government, and their policy, and consumers and education. So looking specifically at the behavior of all of these different stakeholders, we can see how consumers, if they're better informed about the products and their awareness of what they're buying and how they are being treated or how they're living their lives out, meaning if their air quality is bad and they know it's bad, what movements or what policy can be made, and how these consumers can ultimately drive governments to make policies so that they can have the best interests for the consumers. So that kind of goes into the green movement and how policy definitely needed to be changed for greater good for consumers, but because consumers were more educated about, specifically let's reference Silent Spring, when they started figuring out that the DDT was not good. And so because they became more educated, they were influencing not only industries to make a change, because they weren't buying from the companies that produce that, but they also influenced government and policy to have and better influence and better regulate, looking out specifically for the customers and the consumers who were directly impacted by the chemicals. So government and policies are active stakeholders in this situation. The United States and the EPA have the ability to make a stance and take direct changes, influencing more passive stakeholders such as consumers, who ultimately change this. I guess it started out as a niche and then moved into more regime to ultimately find this landscape approach, influencing the intertangledness, I guess, of all these stakeholders within this wicked problem. Interface is a great company to look at in terms of the primary actions and the results that can come from them. So Interface was started by Ray Anderson, and he looked at a study and saw how meeting these pollution limits, and although it might seem like it's good, it's not, and it's not good enough, especially with sustainability. So what they did and what he thought up was of this frontier plan to help divert not only the amount of waste, but how to reuse it and not add anything else. So this is kind of looking at the cradle-to-cradle method within this industry, this carpet industry. So looking here, you can see how they wanted to eliminate waste. So with that, what they actually did was, one of their new products that they came up with was to have and reuse fishing nets. So this was a way for them to recycle something that might have already been thrown away and to help eliminate waste in every way. And then another way to do that was they wanted to improve technologies. They wanted to change and switch to renewable energy. They wanted to redesign processes and products, kind of what I just talked about with bio-based materials. This also goes with transportation. But ultimately, kind of this company wanted to make sure that they were creating a culture that uses sustainability, so that, including the stakeholders, so that consumers can see how important sustainability really is, and how by using this company's products that they have the best interest of the environment and the people, which is really cool. Because as Aaron mentioned before, another positive result of one of these primary actions is government intervention with sustainable development. These are 17 goals that the United Nations have put together to be achieved by 2030 to help promote and influence consumer choices. So some of them, such as no poverty, zero hunger, quality education, But I really want you to focus on affordable and clean energy, which is 7, and then also 8, 9, and then 11 through 12, 13 or so. So these are these goals are trying to influence these main stakeholders such as industry and consumers. With marketing techniques such as green labeling, it will help consumers make more informed decisions about how to influence a culture. So this idea of this regime moving into a more landscape approach with better trust, more innovation, it shows how social change is becoming a more stable and accepted concept, especially driven from these primary actions, with support from government. Though there have been many primary actions that resulted to positive impacts, we can see how acidification is a negative impact. Looking specifically at the biogeochemical cycles, the CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions released in the atmosphere have led to the ocean absorbing it and has resulted to lower pH levels. So the acidification has dropped the pH level from 8.3 to 8.2, which correlates to a 30% decrease according to KARR, which is in a scientific textbook that we use in Sustainability 101. So this is all caused from these excess amounts of carbon dioxide. So as mentioned in the history, there are many effects from the Industrial Revolution, which has caused snowballing effects on how the Earth impacts and reacts too. So these actions are often irreversible and hard to combat. So looking at this infographic, we can see how these pteropod shells can't keep their shells because of how acidic the ocean is becoming, which is ultimately affecting and having a snowball effect on how different species won't have enough nutrients, and ultimately affecting the coral reefs. And because we don't have coral reefs, it affects populations of fish as well. So looking at outsourcing resources, acid rain and pollution are negative results from some of these primary actions. So because the United States has become better with setting standards with minimum wages, working conditions, and pollution standards, it has led companies who want to cut their costs to outsource materials, which is a cheaper route. So although it's cheaper, we can see in this infographic right here that China and India have the highest deaths from air pollution. And this infographic just shows, or is it a picture showing the terrible air quality in China. So corporate pollution in China was so bad that in 2016 alone, about 254 out of 338 cities could not meet the national ambient air quality standards. And that was coming from a study from Liu that I found. So when we look at this, we can see how China and India account for 55% of all air pollution deaths in 2013. So not only, and that was derived from Scientific American Environmental Science for a Changing World, 3rd edition. Sorry, that was a mouthful. But it's just showing how all this pollution is having an effect, and we can definitely see that through acid rain. So in this next slide, it's not only the pollution coming from corporations, but it's also from agriculture, mining, transportation, and all this pollution is getting absorbed into the land, which ultimately affects how the ecosystem works, which directly impacts us, because if we're using agriculture, then we're putting it back into the environment, and we're consuming all this acidic pollution that we are emitting as well.
Drivers of organizational sustainability. And then I went into 4 indirect drivers of those 4 direct drivers. I went along and named the whole diagram corporate culture, and then I just split it into the 4 different sections. My first one being transportation, like companies using cars, planes, jets, and getting them from point A to point B. And it's not that they're trying to hurt the environment, it's just that at the end of the day it actually does and affects it in the long run. My second point was facilities, not using renewable energy, or also just leads to air pollution also and water contamination. My third was corporate funding. Other companies don't really spend the money that they need to find ways to save their company money and save the resources around them and whatever else they're using. My last was resources, which is companies overusing, leading to deforestation, also burning more fossil fuels than what it needs to, and obviously none of this is good for the planet.
So thank you for watching our video. We just wanted to make sure you guys understood everything we talked about and hopefully influence you to think better about your dollar.